Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a really compelling piece of psychology literature today.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
It really is. It's drawn from an article in Psychology Today by Meng and Darby Saxby. And the title poses a pretty stark question.
Right. It asks, are you a nihilist or anhedonic?
Exactly. And our mission here today is to kind of untangle this very specific, honestly, often dangerous confusion between a profound philosophical worldview and a deeply physiological, highly treatable biological deficit.
Which is a huge distinction to make.
Huge. So to really get into this, I want you to consider a scenario that might feel familiar to you listening, or at least, highly recognizable.
I think a lot of people will relate to this.
Definitely. So imagine you spend years grinding toward this one singular objective. We are talking about the relentless sacrifices, the late nights, the deferred gratification, all
With
of it.
hustle, basically.
Right, the hustle. And you operate under the assumption that crossing the finish line, securing the degree, the promotion, buying the house, that it will fundamentally alter your internal landscape.
You think it's going to change how you feel inside.
Yes. But then you arrive. You step through the door of that achievement and the internal shift. It just never happened.
Nothing changing.
Nothing. You look at the life you systematically constructed, and the overriding sensation is just almost entirely hollow.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, it is a incredibly disorienting state to find yourself in.
I can only imagine.
Because the expectation of reward is so hardwired into the effort, right? So when the view from the summit turns out to be completely flat, the brain really struggles to process that discrepancy.
Like it just doesn't compute.
Exactly. You expect this big crescendo, and instead you get static.
And when you get that static, you naturally start questioning the nature of the effort itself. Like, if the ultimate achievement feels empty, the logical leap is that the pursuit was inherently meaningless to begin with. Which brings up the whole Sisyphus analogy from the article.
Yes. The Sisyphus dynamic in real time. For those who don't know, it's the myth where you push the boulder to the top of the hill, watch it roll back down, and just realize the loop itself has no narrative arc.
It's just a loop.
Right, it's just a pointless loop.
Yeah.
And for someone experiencing this, a 2 a.m. Google search for answers often leads straight to existential nihilism.
Which is the philosophical position that existence is without objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value.
Right. And reading that, it probably feels like a perfect diagnosis of their internal emptiness.
Oh, absolutely. The terminology just clicks for them.
Makes sense.
When a person in that state reads that the universe is fundamentally indifferent, it provides this immediate intellectual framework for their subjective experience. It validates the emptiness.
Like, oh, I'm not broken. The universe is just empty.
Exactly. But this is precisely where the source material urges a critical pause. We have to separate the philosophy from the physiology.
Which is the whole crux of our deep dive today.
Yes. The central question is whether this pervasive sense of meaninglessness is actually an intellectual revelation about the cosmos, or if it is just a symptom of a localized failure in the brain's reward circuitry.
A condition called anhedonia.
Right, anhedonia.
And the article points out that anhedonia is notoriously difficult to spot, right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really align with our conventional cultural shorthand for depression.
That is a very critical distinction to make.
How so?
Well, clinically, anhedonia is defined as a severely reduced ability to experience pleasure or anticipate reward. And it is a core diagnostic criterion for major depressive disorder.
Okay.
But as the text points out, depression is frequently and incorrectly modeled solely as the presence of profound sadness or active despair.
We're always looking for the crying.
Right, the crying or the obvious emotional agony. But there's a massive subgroup of individuals with depression who present with anhedonia as their primary symptom.
So no weeping.
No weeping. There is simply a void. It's a diminished capacity to feel that any action, interaction, or outcome carries any weight or value at all.
Wow. So the distinction between the philosophy of nihilism and the symptom of anhedonia, it seems like it would really come down to the mechanism of the emptiness.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think about how we process value, it's not just an intellectual exercise, right?
Yeah.
It's a biological one.
Definitely.
Let's use an analogy. Say it's like having a broken taste bud.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Like if you eat a gourmet meal and it tastes entirely like cardboard, the problem isn't that the chef made bad food. That would be like blaming the philosophy of the universe.
Right. The universe isn't the problem.
Exactly. The problem is that your tongue literally can't process the flavor. That's your physiology. Or Another way to look at it, think of an algorithmic social media feed.
Okay, yeah.
If the algorithm suddenly stops receiving likes or engagement metrics, it doesn't self-diagnose and assume its own internal code is broken?
No, it assumes the content is bad.
Exactly. It assumes the content it is processing is inherently worthless, so it just stops serving it up. It flattens the output.
That algorithmic analogy actually tracks incredibly closely with the actual neurobiology at play here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When we talk about anhedonia, we are looking at disruptions in the brain's reward pathways, primarily involving dopamine.
Okay, dopamine.
But it's not just about the inability to enjoy something in the moment, what we clinically call consummatory reward.
So it's not just the present moment.
No, it heavily impacts anticipatory reward, too. The brain is basically a predictive engine.
It's always guessing what's next.
Right. It constantly projects forward, estimating the value of future actions. And anhedonia effectively breaks that predictive algorithm.
Wow.
It stops signaling that a future interaction with friends or a career milestone will yield any positive reinforcement at all.
So if the brain's predictive engine is failing to generate that chemical expectation of value, the intellect just steps in to make sense of the data it's receiving.
Exactly. It tries to rationalize the deficit.
Right, so if the internal feed registers zero engagement with the outside world, the intellect concludes that the outside world has no value.
Yes.
You assume the universe is meaningless, rather than recognizing that your own internal mechanism for processing meaning has temporarily gone offline.
And subjectively, from the perspective of the person experiencing it, a philosophical realization and a biological deficit are completely indistinguishable.
They feel exactly the same.
Exactly. The absence of feeling is simply interpreted as the presence of truth.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Yeah.
This overlap isn't just a byproduct of modern diagnostic criteria. The historical context in the article illustrates that philosophers were wrestling with this long before we had functional MRI machines mapping out dopamine pathways.
That's true. They were noticing this way back.
The article specifically points to Friedrich Nietzsche, which is fascinating because he is, arguably the most recognizable figure associated with nihilism.
The poster child for it, basically.
Right, but he wasn't just writing about it as some cold academic theorem.
No, not at all. He was observing it as a lived experience.
Right.
In his posthumously published notes, which were eventually compiled as The Will to Power, Nietzsche framed nihilism largely as a psychological state.
A psychological state.
Yeah. He noted that this state emerges when a person faces persistent, grinding failure in their attempts to find or construct meaning.
Just constant discouragement.
Exactly, leading to a profound systemic discouragement. And he actually drew a very specific line between existential nihilism, the objective philosophical stance, and what he called affective nihilism.
Affective, meaning rooted in mood, emotion, and physical sensation.
Right. Nietzsche described affective nihilism as a profound weariness. It is a literal physiological exhaustion toward life itself.
That is wild.
It is remarkable, right? In the late 19th century, decades before the formal conceptualization of clinical anhedonia, Nietzsche recognized this.
He saw it.
He saw that a meaning-void worldview often originates not from rigorous, abstract intellectual deduction, but from the physical accumulation of fatigue and the chronic absence of joy.
So the body gives out, and the mind constructs a philosophy to justify the surrender.
Exactly.
Wait, so is modern science basically saying our brains retroactively justify a chemical lack of joy by deciding the entire universe is meaningless?
Yes, that's exactly what's happening.
Like we reverse engineer philosophy just to explain our bad mood. That dynamic completely flips our standard assumption about how beliefs are formed.
It really does. What's fascinating here is that we generally operate under the premise that our philosophy dictates our emotional state.
Right, you think, I believe this, therefore I feel this.
Exactly. You deduce that the world is inherently meaningless, and therefore you feel emotionally detached. But the science suggests the causality frequently runs in the exact opposite direction.
Wow.
It is a textbook case of resolving cognitive dissonance. The brain demands explanations for its own internal states.
It hates not knowing why it feels bad.
Exactly. And the authors cite empirical studies that demonstrate how heavily our baseline emotional state dictates our global beliefs.
What kind of studies?
Well, for example, research consistently shows that elevated positive affect, simply experiencing positive emotions regularly, strongly correlates with a higher reported sense of meaning in life.
Oh, interesting. So just feeling good makes life feel meaningful.
Yes. And conversely, when meaning in life scores drop, It is tightly coupled with rising levels of anhedonia.
So the subjective feeling of meaning isn't an intellectual conclusion at all. It is an emotional byproduct.
Basically, yes.
If the neurochemical foundation of motivation and pleasure collapses, the brain looks at the resulting behavioral paralysis and says, well, the most logical explanation for why we aren't doing anything is that nothing is worth doing.
It makes sense from a survival standpoint.
The brain reverse engineers a massive, sweeping metaphysical philosophy simply to explain a localized dopamine deficit.
It is a defense mechanism, in a way.
How so?
Because acknowledging that your own perception is biologically skewed is terrifying.
Oh, yeah. That's a scary thought.
Right. It is far more comfortable and perhaps more stabilizing for the ego to believe that your perception is perfectly clear and that the world itself is simply broken and void of purpose.
That makes total sense. Claiming a philosophical stance offers a sense of control over the emptiness.
Exactly. You feel like you figured it out.
But if we establish that a chemical lack of joy can generate nihilistic thoughts, we do have to address the other side of the equation.
Right, to be fair.
Because not everyone who subscribes to nihilism is suffering from a biological deficit. There are plenty of people who firmly believe the universe is a random, uncaring void, and they navigate that reality with an immense amount of energy and satisfaction.
Which proves that existential nihilism and anhedonia are not intrinsically linked.
They aren't the same thing.
No. It is entirely possible to look at the vast, unscripted reality of a meaningless universe and respond not with despair, but with profound curiosity, engagement, and joy. The philosophical realization that there is no inherent cosmic meaning can actually be an incredibly liberating framework.
Because there's no pressure.
Right. If the universe hasn't assigned you a purpose, you are entirely free to assign one to yourself.
That's a great way to look at it. And the article references Albert Camus to illustrate this exact point.
Yes, Camus is a perfect example here.
He argued that the universe is fundamentally absurd, right? That our desire for meaning is constantly met by the cold silence of the world.
The silent universe.
But his response to that absurdity wasn't effective nihilism or withdrawal. He used the Sisyphus myth, suggesting that the very act of pushing the boulder, the sheer conscious defiance of living fully within the absurdity, generates its own meaning.
The struggle itself is enough.
Yes. He concluded that we must imagine Sisyphus happy.
And beyond the rigorous existentialists like Camus, the authors also point to the modern concept of the hedonistic nihilist.
The YOLO crowd.
Exactly. These are individuals who accept the premise that existence is a momentary blip without grand consequence, and their logical response is simply to maximize the experience while it lasts.
Makes sense.
The realization of meaninglessness doesn't blunt their reward circuitry. It often supercharges it by removing the pressure of cosmic expectations.
Okay, let's apply a practical filter to this to separate the two states for the listener.
Okay.
Take the experience of a great meal with friends, like eating a slice of pizza.
Good example.
An existential nihilist can maintain their core belief that human history is just an infinitesimal speck in a cold universe, while simultaneously experiencing intense, genuine pleasure from the conversation and the food.
Right. They can still enjoy the pizza.
Exactly. Their dopamine pathways are fully operational. They just don't attach cosmic significance to the dopamine hit.
That distinction is the crux of the issue.
Right?
The existential nihilist retains the capacity for subjective value. They can feel the warmth of the interaction. Someone suffering from anhedonia cannot.
Even if they want to.
Exactly. Even if they cognitively recognize that they love their friends or that the pizza is excellent, the biological translation of that data into the feeling of joy is blocked.
It just doesn't get through.
The reward prediction error fails, and the experience registers as flat.
So, if the capacity to feel pleasure is still intact, your nihilism is a chosen philosophical lens.
Yes.
But if the capacity for pleasure is systematically offline across all domains of life, the nihilism is likely a symptom masquerading as a philosophy.
That's a great summary.
Which brings us to why this distinction is so crucial. Because analyzing the overlap between 19th century philosophy and modern neurobiology is intellectually stimulating.
It's fun for a dinner party.
Right. But the article emphasizes that confusing these two states has profound, highly dangerous clinical consequences.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the stakes are immense.
Tell me more about that.
It's primarily because of how misattribution dictates behavior.
Okay.
If a person misinterprets the clinical symptom of anhedonia as a sophisticated metaphysical position, if they view their detachment as a sign that they have simply seen through the illusion of reality, they are actively disincentivized from seeking medical or psychological intervention.
Right, it provides this intellectual shield against being a patient.
Exactly.
If you believe your suffering is just the burden of higher intelligence or philosophical clarity, you aren't going to call a therapist. You don't take medication to cure a realization about the universe.
And that delay in intervention is where the physical danger really compounds.
It gets worse.
Much worse. The source material outlines significant clinical data regarding the trajectory of untreated anhedonia. It is not just a secondary feature of depression that makes life less colorful. It is a primary driver of severe outcomes.
Wow.
Specifically, persistent anhedonia is a potent predictor of enduring suicidal ideation.
What's particularly striking in the text is that this risk factor operates somewhat independently.
That's the scary part.
Yeah, the anhedonia can continue to predict suicidal ideation even after the more visible symptoms of depression. The crying, the active sadness have been mitigated by preliminary treatment.
That independence is precisely why it is so dangerous. A patient might look better to their family.
Right, they aren't crying anymore.
And they might even report feeling less acute sorrow. But if the fundamental capacity to experience reward and anticipate value remains broken, the risk of suicide remains highly elevated.
Because there's nothing to look forward to.
Exactly. The brain is still failing to project any future state worth experiencing.
And the authors highlight a specific potent vulnerability that emerges when these two forces, that the biological deficit and the philosophical framework, lock together.
The feedback loop.
Right. When a person is experiencing severe anhedonia, and they solidify an intellectual belief in nihilism to explain it, it creates a feedback loop that is incredibly difficult to break.
The research actually indicates that nihilism itself can independently amplify the risk of suicidal ideation.
Wait, really?
Yeah. When you fuse the physical inability to register joy with the entrenched intellectual conviction that existence has no value, you basically strip away every available defense mechanism.
You have nothing left to fall back on.
Exactly. If a person in that state encounters interpersonal distress, say a severe conflict, a loss of employment, a social rejection, they have no physiological buffer and no philosophical safety net.
It's all just raw impact.
The impact of the negative event is magnified exponentially because there is no counterbalancing belief or sensation that things will eventually improve.
The authors are careful to point out, though, that nihilism is not inherently pathological.
Right. We want to be clear on that.
It is a valid philosophical stance. But when it is weaponized by anhedonia, it becomes the logic that justifies the despair.
That is the crucial takeaway. If your internal machinery is failing to produce the chemicals required to feel motivation or meaning, it is absolutely imperative to question the philosophies that emerge from that state.
Which brings us back to that 2 a.m. Google search we talked about earlier. For anyone listening who recognizes their own internal state in this discussion, who looks at their achievements, their relationships, or their future, and feels an overwhelming, persistent flatness, the authors offer a vital litmus test to apply to your own experience.
It requires a bit of a thought experiment.
Walk us through.
You have to ask yourself, is the root of this emptiness philosophical or is it physiological?
Okay.
Imagine a scenario where tomorrow your neurobiology was entirely reset.
Like a magic wand.
Right. If you baseline interest, your intrinsic motivation, and your sheer capacity to experience pleasure were fully restored, if you could biologically feel the joy of a sunny day or the satisfaction of a job well done, would the world still feel unbearably pointless?
Such a powerful question. So what does this all mean? Well, if the answer is no, if the return of the feeling would solve the existential crisis, then the philosophy is really just a symptom of the machinery.
It's just the brain talking.
And as the authors of the piece so elegantly frame it, you don't have to abandon your intellect or change your fundamental beliefs about the cosmos to change your brain.
You really don't.
Treating the biological deficit doesn't mean admitting defeat in some grand philosophical debate. It simply means cleaning the lens through which you are viewing that philosophy.
Restoring the baseline capacity for reward gives you the clarity to decide what you actually believe, rather than just surviving what you feel.
Well said. As we conclude this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought, to consider one that extends beyond the immediate scope of the article, but is directly provoked by it.
It's a big one.
We spend our lives constructing our identities around our deepest philosophical convictions, our morals, and our worldview. We view these beliefs as the bedrock of who we are.
Of course we do.
But if our most profound conclusions about the nature of reality and the value of existence can be entirely written, rewritten, or erased by the subtle fluctuations of dopamine and reward prediction algorithms in the brain, how much of what we consider our sovereign intellectual identity is actually just our biology speaking on our behalf?
It definitely forces a necessary humility about how we perceive our own certainties.
It absolutely does. Before we sign off, it is critical that we provide the resources highlighted in today's material. If you are listening to this and that sense of emptiness feels insurmountable, or if you are dealing with suicidal thoughts, please do not navigate it alone.
Yes, please reach out.
The intellectual shield is not worth the risk. If you're in the United States, immediate help is available 247 by dialing 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you prefer not to call, you can reach the crisis text line by texting the word TALK, that's T-A-L-K, to 741-741.
We highly encourage reaching out to a medical or psychological professional who can help untangle the philosophy from the physiology.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this exploration today. Until next time, keep questioning the lens through which you view the world.